The translation error was discovered 14 hours after the original broadcast, but by then it no longer mattered whether it had been an error at all. Ambassador Korr of the Drannic Concordat had delivered his closing remarks at the Outer Rim Trade Symposium to a hall of 300 delegates, 12 species, and one human interpreter named Daniel Reyes, who had spent 6 years learning to translate Drannic dialects with a precision that bordered on obsession. What Korr said, in formal Drannic, was a phrase that translated literally to, "Your young units serve no productive function." It was a common Drannic insult, used to dismiss a rival's investment in something the speaker considered wasteful. Among the Drannic, it was rude. Among humans, when Reyes rendered it faithfully into standard for the assembled delegates, it became something else entirely. He says human children are livestock. Reyes said into the broadcast feed, his voice flat with the professional neutrality his job demanded, that they serve no productive function, that they are raised the way other species raise food. The hall went quiet. Then it did not stay quiet. Within 6 hours, the clip had reached every human colony, every Earth-based network, every parent who had ever held a child and would never have imagined needing to defend that child's worth to anyone, let alone an alien standing behind a podium. Within 12 hours, linguists at the University of Nairobi's Xenolinguistics Institute had confirmed what Reyes already suspected. The Drannic phrase was an idiom, not a literal statement. It was the rough equivalent of calling an investment throwing money into a hole. Crude, dismissive, but not actually a claim that human children were livestock. Within 14 hours, that correction reached the Drannic Concordat's embassy on Earth. It did not reach the Drannic Concordat's government, because Ambassador Korr, certain that the controversy was beneath his attention, had not bothered to forward it. Foreign Minister Adaeze Okonkwo received the briefing in her office in Lagos at 2 in the morning, woken by an aide who understood that some news could not wait until sunrise. "Show me the clip," she said, still pulling a robe over her shoulders. She watched it twice, the first time as a diplomat, the second time as a mother. "Has the embassy issued a correction?" "No, ma'am. We've sent 3 formal requests for clarification. All 3 have gone unanswered. And the original translation. Is it accurate?" "Technically, yes. The words mean what Reyes said they mean. But our linguists confirm it's an idiom. The Drannic almost certainly didn't intend it as a literal statement about human children." Okonkwo sat down slowly. "Then this is something that can still be resolved." "It can," the aide agreed, "if they want it resolved." By morning, the question of whether it could be resolved had become considerably more complicated, because Ambassador Korr, asked directly by a Drannic news service whether he wished to clarify his remarks, had declined. "I said what I said," Korr told the reporter, his translator rendering his irritation with technical accuracy. "If the humans lack the sophistication to understand a simple turn of phrase, that says more about them than about me. I will not apologize for their poor grasp of language." It was, Okonkwo would later reflect, the single worst sentence any alien diplomat had spoken to a human audience since first contact. Not because of what it said about human children. Because of what it revealed about Korr's certainty that no apology was owed and no consequence would follow. The Drannic Concordat was not a major galactic power. It controlled 4-star systems, maintained a modest trade fleet, and had built its entire foreign policy around a reputation for being difficult to push around, a reputation earned through decades of refusing to back down from minor disputes with larger neighbors. The strategy had worked for 2 centuries. The Concordat had never lost a diplomatic standoff by simply outlasting the other side's patience. High Chancellor Vren Tassic, the Concordat's head of state, received the report on the growing human outrage with the same dismissiveness Korr had shown the reporter. "They are upset about an idiom," Tassic said to his cabinet, gathered in the modest stone chamber that served as the Concordat's seat of government. "This will pass. It always passes. We do not apologize to trading partners over linguistic misunderstandings. It establishes a precedent of weakness." "Chancellor, with respect," said Defense Minister Corin Vassal, the only member of the cabinet who had spent meaningful time studying human behavior, "I would urge caution. The humans have reacted to this with an intensity that doesn't match our experience with other species." "Every species postures over insults," Tassic replied. The variant postured for a year over a trade dispute that amounted to nothing. The Ithrani postured for 2 years over a border dispute. We simply wait. They will tire of the outrage, the news cycle will move to something else, and we will continue trading as before. This isn't a trade dispute, Vassal said. This is about their children. Tasic waved a hand. Sentiment is not strategy, Minister. I will not have the Concordat's foreign policy dictated by an emotional overreaction to a turn of phrase. What Tasic did not understand, and what Vassal could not adequately explain to a cabinet that had never needed to understand it, was that humans did not separate sentiment from strategy in the way the Concordat assumed they would. For humans, the protection of children was not an emotional indulgence layered on top of rational interest. It was, in the deepest evolutionary and cultural sense, the rational interest itself, the thing every other strategic calculation existed to serve. 3 days after the broadcast, the Drannic embassy in Lagos received a formal diplomatic note from the Human Coalition Foreign Ministry. It requested 3 things: a public clarification of Ambassador Korr's remarks, a formal apology for the offense caused regardless of intent, and Korr's reassignment away from human-facing diplomatic posts. The note was measured, professional, and gave the Concordat an easy path to resolve the matter with minimal cost. It was the kind of note designed by people who genuinely wanted the crisis to end quietly. Chancellor Tasic's cabinet debated the response for 2 days. Minister Vassal argued strongly for compliance, pointing out that the requested concessions cost the Concordat nothing of substance. Reassigning one ambassador and issuing a clarification was a trivial price for ending a controversy that was, by his own assessment, growing more dangerous by the day. He was outvoted. The cabinet's majority view, shaped by 2 centuries of successful brinkmanship with other species, held that any concession would be read as weakness, and weakness invited further demands. The Concordat had survived as a minor power among larger neighbors precisely because it never gave ground first. The formal response, delivered 6 days after the original broadcast, declined all 3 requests. It characterized the human reaction as disproportionate to a minor linguistic ambiguity, and suggested that Earth's diplomatic corps exercise greater composure in future cultural exchanges. Adaise Okonkwo read the response in her office, alongside General Priya Sharma, who had been quietly looped into the crisis 3 days earlier, as a precaution that was beginning to look less precautionary by the hour. "They're calling it disproportionate," Okonkwo said. "They don't understand what they've done," Sharma replied. "Or they don't believe it matters. Does it matter, militarily? 4-star systems. A modest fleet. This isn't a threat to us in any conventional sense." Sharma considered the question carefully before answering. "No, it isn't a threat. But, General, I don't think threat assessment is what's driving the public response to this. I think we're past the point where this gets resolved through normal diplomatic channels." Okonkwo had spent 11 years in foreign policy, long enough to recognize when a crisis had stopped being about the triggering incident and started being about something larger. "Then what do you recommend?" "I recommend we let the public process run its course before we decide anything. This isn't a decision the coalition government should make alone." What followed over the next 2 weeks was not a coordinated government campaign, because no government coordinated it. It was something that emerged from 400 million individual households across Earth and its colonies, each reaching the same conclusion through the same evidence at roughly the same time. Parent advocacy groups, normally focused on local school policy and pediatric healthcare funding, began organizing demonstrations outside Drannic trade offices in 19 cities. The demonstrations were peaceful, largely silent, often consisting of parents simply standing with their children, holding no signs at all, communicating something that required no signage, Katamsir boycotts of Drannic Earth trade products, organized through social platforms with no central leadership, reduced Drannic import revenue by 40% within 10 days. Shipping unions in 3 major ports refused to handle Drannic cargo, citing safety concerns that everyone understood were not really about safety. Military recruitment offices across Earth reported a measurable uptick in applications, though no recruiter had asked for it, and no advertisement had referenced the Korr incident. People simply began showing up. Colonel James Whitfield, commanding the human garrison nearest Drannic space, found himself fielding an unusual number of volunteer transfer requests from soldiers stationed on the opposite side of the solar system. "Why do you want this posting?" he asked one such applicant, a logistics officer with no combat specialty and no prior interest in frontier assignments. "No particular reason, sir," the officer said. "Just felt like I should be closer in case." "In case of what?" The officer didn't have a clear answer. Whitfield didn't need one. He understood the feeling because he shared it, and he suspected most of the people now requesting transfers shared it too, an inarticulate certainty that something was coming, and they wanted to be where it would matter. High Chancellor Tasic watched the trade figures with growing alarm, though he remained convinced the underlying crisis would resolve itself once human attention moved elsewhere. 40% reduction in import revenue, reported his trade minister. "If this continues another month, 3 of our agricultural sectors will face supply shortages. We rely on human grain imports for sectors that cannot produce sufficient yield locally." "It will pass," Tasic insisted, though with less certainty than he had shown 2 weeks earlier. "Chancellor, may I speak candidly?" Minister Vassal asked. "I do not believe it will pass. I believe we have fundamentally misjudged this species. And I believe every day we wait to correct that misjudgment makes the eventual cost higher. You believe the humans will go to war over an idiom. I believe the humans have already decided something about us that has nothing to do with the idiom anymore," Vassal said. "I believe they have decided we do not respect them. And I believe that decision is now permanent, regardless of what we do next, unless we do something significant enough to reverse it." Tasic considered this for a long moment, the first genuine consideration he had given Vassal's warnings since the crisis began. "What would you have us do?" "Recall Ambassador Korr immediately. Issue a direct apology from your office, not a ministry statement, and request a formal audience with the coalition government to address the matter in person. That is everything they originally asked for and more." 2 weeks ago. "Yes, I am no longer confident it is enough now." Tasic authorized the recall of Ambassador Korr that afternoon. It was, by every measure of Concordat political tradition, an extraordinary concession, the kind of reversal that would have been unthinkable to the cabinet that had voted against compliance 6 days into the crisis. It arrived 19 days too late to matter in the way Tasic hoped it would. The incident that ended any possibility of a quiet resolution occurred on a Drannic trade station orbiting the joint commercial hub at Meridian Crossing, a neutral waypoint used by a dozen species for transit and trade. A group of Drannic merchants, frustrated by the collapse of their earth trade revenue and emboldened by 2 weeks of cabinet messaging that characterized the human reaction as an overreaction, confronted a human trade delegation in the station's central concourse. What began as shouted grievances about lost business escalated, within minutes, into a physical altercation. Security footage later confirmed that the Drannic merchants struck first. It also confirmed something the Concordat would have preferred remained unrecorded. In the chaos of the confrontation, one of the merchants shouted the same phrase that had started the entire crisis, this time with clear intent, aimed directly at a human delegate's young daughter, present on the station as part of a family diplomatic posting. The girl was 9 years old. She was not harmed, but the footage of a grown Drannic merchant screaming a slur about her worth as a human child, captured from 4 separate angles by station security and uploaded within the hour, did something the original mistranslation never could. It removed all ambiguity. President Marcus Webb, no relation to the general who had once commanded Earth's defense during the Concorde crisis decades earlier, but bearing a name that history would now associate with 2 different moments of human resolve, addressed the coalition government 6 hours after the Meridian Crossing footage went public. "For 3 weeks we have extended the Drannic Concordat every reasonable opportunity to resolve a misunderstanding," Webb said. His address carried on every human network and colony relay simultaneously. "We accepted that the original remarks may have been a linguistic accident. We requested clarification through every proper channel. We were rebuffed, dismissed, and told that our reaction was disproportionate." He paused, allowing the silence to carry its own weight. What happened today at Meridian Crossing was not a translation error. It was a choice made by an adult directed at a child, with full understanding of what the words meant in the language he chose to use them in. I will not stand before you and call this a misunderstanding, because it was not one. Foreign Minister Okonkwo, seated behind him, had spent the preceding 6 hours in continuous contact with Coalition Military Command, the Drannic Embassy, and the family of the child involved, who had requested, with a composure that humbled everyone who spoke with them, that their daughter's identity not be used to inflame the situation further. "We will honor that family's wishes for privacy," Webb continued, "but we will not honor the Concordat's continued refusal to take responsibility for a culture of contempt that allowed one of its diplomats to set this tone and one of its citizens to act on it. Effective immediately, the coalition is suspending all diplomatic and trade relations with the Drannic Concordat and deploying a defensive task force to protect human personnel and interests throughout the region." It was, notably, not a declaration of war. Webb had chosen his words with the same precision Daniel Reyes had once used to translate Korr's original insult, and the precision was deliberate. Humanity was not initiating a conflict. It was making unmistakably clear what would happen if the Concordat mistook restraint for permission. High Chancellor Tassic received Webb's address with something that, for the first time since the crisis began, resembled genuine fear rather than irritation. "A defensive task force," he repeated to his assembled cabinet. "Minister Vassal, what does our intelligence suggest about human military capability in this region?" "Concerning," Vassal said bluntly. "We have no current data on human fleet strength near our space, but historical precedent suggests we should assume more than our older estimates indicate. The Concord crisis taught every species in this region the same lesson, Chancellor, even if we chose not to fully absorb it. Human military capability tends to exceed visible indicators by a significant margin, particularly once they have decided a conflict is justified. You're suggesting we cannot win a conflict with them. I'm suggesting we should not test that question to find out," Vassal said. "Chancellor, I recommend immediate, unconditional compliance with every demand they have made or might make. I recommend Korr's formal extradition for the merchant's assault investigation, full reparations to the family involved, and a personal address from you, broadcast on human networks, taking complete responsibility. Extradition. That is unprecedented for a diplomatic incident. Everything about this situation is unprecedented, Chancellor. We allowed 2 weeks of cabinet pride to convert a translation error into an international incident, and an international incident into a confrontation that nearly resulted in violence against a child. We do not have the standing left to negotiate from a position of dignity. We have only the choice of how much further dignity we are willing to lose before we act." Tassic sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 19 wasted days settling over him fully for the first time. "Draft the broadcast," he said finally. "And Minister Vassal, arrange Korr's transport personally. I want no further delays of any kind." The broadcast Tassic delivered 3 days later was unlike anything the Drannic Concordat had produced in its 2-century history of careful, deliberate, diplomatic messaging. It contained no qualifications, no context offered to soften the admission, no language designed to preserve institutional dignity. "I failed my people and yours," Tassic said, addressing the human audience directly, his translator rendering every word with a flatness that somehow made the admission more affecting rather than less. "I was warned repeatedly by advisors who understood what I did not, that a culture of dismissiveness toward your concerns would produce consequences I was not prepared to accept. I dismissed those warnings because I believed our traditional approach to diplomatic disputes would serve us as it always had. I was wrong, and that wrongness nearly cost an innocent child her sense of safety in a place that should have been safe for everyone." Ambassador Korr arrived on Earth 4 days later, in Concordat custody, to face formal proceedings related to his conduct and the broader investigation into the Meridian Crossing assault. He did not offer the defiant justification he had given the Drannic News Service 3 weeks earlier. Whatever certainty had carried him through that interview had not survived the intervening weeks. The legal proceedings that followed were conducted with a transparency the Concordat had never extended to an internal matter before. Every hearing broadcast, every piece of evidence made public, a complete reversal of the institutional instinct toward managed disclosure that had defined Concordat governance for 2 centuries. 6 months after the broadcast, the family at the center of the Meridian Crossing incident agreed for the first time to a single supervised meeting with Chancellor Tasic, conducted at their request rather than his. The girl, now 10, sat beside her parents in a quiet room in Lagos that had been arranged with deliberate informality. No cameras, no advisors, beyond a single translator for each side. "I wanted to ask you something," she said to Tasic, with the directness children sometimes manage before they learn to soften difficult questions. "Did you think I wasn't worth anything? Is that why nobody said sorry for so long?" Tasic, who had given careful diplomatic answers to difficult questions for most of his political career, found that none of his prepared language fit the moment. "No," he said finally, "I did not think that. But I think, for a long time, I cared more about not appearing weak than I cared about whether what I was doing was right. And I am sorry that my pride cost you weeks of fear that you should never have had to carry." The girl considered this with the seriousness children bring to questions adults often answer too quickly. "My mom says humans forgive people who actually mean it. Do you mean it?" "I do." "Okay," she said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of any further test or condition, did something to Tasic that 19 days of cabinet warnings and 3 weeks of trade collapse had not managed to do. It made the cost of his initial dismissiveness finally real to him. 1 year after the broadcast, the Drannic Concordat had become, somewhat improbably, one of humanity's closer trading partners in the region, not despite the crisis, but through the deliberate, sustained effort both sides had invested in rebuilding what the crisis had broken. Minister Vassal, promoted to foreign minister in the cabinet reshuffling that followed the incident, oversaw the negotiation of a new diplomatic protocol between the Concordat and the coalition, one that included, at human insistence but with full Concordat agreement, mandatory cultural sensitivity training for any diplomat assigned to human-facing posts, and a standing translation review board to catch exactly the kind of ambiguity that had started the entire crisis. "We could have avoided all of this with the board you're proposing now," Vassal said to Foreign Minister Okonkwo during the final negotiation session. "If only we'd built it before the crisis instead of after." Okonkwo considered this for a moment. Maybe, or maybe some lessons only get learned the expensive way, no matter how good the architecture is. What matters now is that you built it and that you meant it. "You sound like a child I once met," Vassal said. "I've heard," Okonkwo said, "that she has a way of getting to the point." The girl, now 11, was invited the following spring to the formal signing ceremony of the new diplomatic protocol, an invitation extended by Chancellor Tasic personally and accepted, after careful family discussion, on the condition that the day remain about the agreement and not about her. She stood at the back of the ceremony, unremarked upon by any official statement, watching 2 governments commit, in writing, to a standard her own simple question had done more to establish than either side's diplomats fully understood. Daniel Reyes, the interpreter whose faithful translation had started everything, continued his work at the Xenolinguistics Institute, now leading the very translation review board the new protocol established. He kept in his office a small printed transcript of his original broadcast, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the words a translator chooses carry weight he cannot always predict, and that the responsibility of getting them right extends further than any single conversation. What the crisis ultimately taught every species watching from beyond the Concordat's 4 systems was not a lesson about military strength, because no battle had been fought, no fleet had engaged, no weapon had been fired in anger. It was a different lesson, one that traveled further and lasted longer than any combat report could have. It was that humanity's fiercest defenses were not reserved only for war. They extended, with equal and immediate intensity, to anyone who threatened the smallest and most vulnerable among them, and that the line between disrespecting a child and discovering exactly how far an entire species would go to protect one was thinner, and far more dangerous to cross, than anyone outside humanity had ever fully understood.